Welcome to Historical Drama with the Boston Sisters, where we talk about historical films and dramatic series as windows to the past and mirrors of the present. I'm Michon Boston.
And I'm Tequina Boston.
Tequina and I made a trip to the Folger Shakespeare Library in Washington, D.C. to talk with Dr. Heather Wolfe, the Folger's Curator of Manuscripts. The Folger Shakespeare Library makes William Shakespeare's stories and the world in which he lived accessible to the visiting public, from interactive exhibits to performances, research, and educational programming. The Folger holds the world's largest Shakespeare collection. It's a place where curiosity and creativity are embraced and conversation is always encouraged.
If you're tuned into the PBS Masterpiece series Wolfe Hall, The Mirror and the Light, or catching up on the first Wolfe Hall series, which is available for streaming, you may be curious to know about the Folger Shakespeare Library exhibit, How to Be a Power Player, Tudor Edition, curated by our podcast guest, Dr. Heather Wolfe. Power and political prowess are prominent in Wolfe Hall, The Mirror and the Light, adapted from the late author Hilary Mantel's final historical novel in the trilogy that follows the journey of Thomas Cromwell, from a self-made man to the most feared and influential figure in King Henry VIII's English court. Thomas Cromwell is played by Mark Rylance. Henry VIII is played by Damian Lewis. Kate Phillips portrays Jane Seymour. Dana Herforth appears as Anne of Cleves, and Jonathan Price is Archbishop Wolsey.
This podcast features our conversation with Dr. Heather Wolfe about the exhibit, How to Be a Power Player, Tudor Edition, which is the historical backdrop for Wolfe Hall, The Mirror and the Light. Heather shared her knowledge about power and influence in the Tudor period, when Thomas Cromwell served King Henry VIII from 1532 to 1540. She also pulled together several manuscripts from the Folger collection related to Cromwell and Henry VIII's fourth wife, Anne of Cleves. This was an extra bonus for the podcast. Tequina and I encourage you to explore the Folger Shakespeare Library's exhibit and collections, online and or in person, so you too can learn the 13 ways to be a power player in Tudor Times, and to see how Tudor courtiers and ladies are similar and different from 21st century power players today. At the end of the podcast, we'll share more information about where you can find the exhibit How to Be a Power Player, Tudor Edition, and catch the series Wolfe Hall, The Mirror and the Light. Tequina and I wanted to know more about Heather's responsibilities as Folger Shakespeare's Curator of Manuscripts and the inspiration for the exhibit, How to Be a Power Player, Tudor Edition.
So I'm Curator of Manuscripts here, and I've been at the Folger since 2000. And my primary responsibility is the care and feeding of all of the handwritten documents in the collection. We have tens of thousands of manuscripts ranging in date from the 12th century to the present day. But the real heart of the collection is the period of the 16th and 17th century, so like the 1530s up to 1700, where we have thousands of manuscripts written by men and women of all different social statuses that just tell a wonderful story and provide voices and context for understanding Shakespeare in his time. So as part of my responsibilities at the Folger, one of my favorite things that I do is teach paleography, which is the study of handwriting, in this case, the handwriting that was used in Shakespeare's period, which was known as English secretary hand. And a lot of the letter forms are very different from the letter forms we recognize today. And so teaching students how to read the handwriting so that they can understand the documents from the past is one of the most rewarding aspects. But we build the collection constantly. So we're always acquiring and looking for new material that will provide research material for the researchers who come and use the collection every day. The idea of power players was floated many years ago, like 2 or 3, 4 years ago, and with no specific time period in mind. And as I was mulling over how to make the exhibition relevant in 2025, this was last summer, I was walking through airports and looking at bookstores, in my summer travels. I'm like, gosh, there are all these playbooks for how to be a leader, all these management style guides, and that reminded me so much of the books that were popular in the Tudor period. In the Tudor period, they weren't called playbooks. They went by Mirrors for Princes or courtesy books, but they were essentially how-to manuals for how to succeed, climb the social hierarchy, become a power player in the early modern period. And so that idea then became the kernel of the exhibition, which is designed like a book. So the introductory panel looks like a dust jacket of a modern management style leadership guide. And then each case in the exhibition is a different rule in that playbook. It's a rule or it's a skill that you need to have to succeed in the period.
How to Be a Power Player Tudor Edition includes a tagline that comes from William Shakespeare. It goes, "Some rise by sin, and some by virtue fall." Michon and I felt the tagline fit Thomas Cromwell's story in The Mirror and the Light. In the press release for the exhibit, Heather said, quote, "When I was selecting items for the exhibition, I was continually struck by the similarities between the self-help books for managers and leaders today and the how-to books for aspiring power players from the 16th century," end quote. So we asked Heather about ways being a power player in Tudor times mirrors what it takes to be a 21st century power player.
To be a power player, it was all about relationships and networking then and today. And when those relationships got wobbly or the networks or factions shifted a little bit, you're in a very dangerous, precarious position. So, I like to think of power playing Tudor style as acquiring all these different soft skills and actual technical skills, but then knowing all these other things about branding and disseminating your image and getting your story told in exactly the way you needed it to be told. So managing your reputation all the time. And there are lots of ways that people did that. And that's why it was so much fun to structure the exhibition around these rules, which I made up based on the strengths in the collection, but then realized, no, these actually really hold true. The first rule was read the playbooks. So in the 1530s, there were a couple of really important manuals that came out. There was Machiavelli's The Prince, and there was Baldassare Castiglione's The Book of the Courtier. We'll just focus on those two. Machiavelli was all about the end justifies the means, it is wiser to be feared than loved, capture and colonize, and appearances are everything. And Machiavelli's philosophy was very controversial in this period because it was stepping back from the morals from religion and from classical literature and saying, you need to bend the rules sometimes. You can look moral, but you might have to act in an immoral manner. And this book was so controversial that it was banned in Italy. And we have a copy at the Folger that was printed in 1584, so, under Elizabeth's period. And because the book was banned, this book was published as a false imprint. So it looks like it was published in Italy, and the English printer printed it thinking it would be for the Italian market. It's in Italian. But English people wanted to read Machiavelli too. And so the copy that we have on display is all marked up with someone reading it very closely and checking off things that they want to remember and adding their own sort of guidance in the beginning of it in handwriting. And so that told me, okay, Machiavelli was definitely a thing. Even though it was banned, people were using that as sort of a guide to navigate through the power structures of the period. And then the other big playbook was called the Book of the Courtier, and that contained instructions for all kinds of things having to do with like dancing and elocution and writing and hospitality, hunting and falconry, all those skills you needed to master in order to be able to gain proximity to the highest levels of power. I mean, one of the best ways to get on the inside track to power was to be invited to go hunting with the king, or later with Queen Elizabeth, who loved to hunt. But you couldn't just be a novice and go out there and hunt. You needed to practice. You needed stables. You needed kennels for your hunting dogs. You needed a breeding program, to get the best hunting dogs. You needed to learn veterinary care or have the best vets there to help you take care of your animals. And then falconry was this whole other skill, with hawks being involved in the hunt. And I like to think of the modern equivalent of that as being golfing. Going out on the golf course, you're away from, all the prying ears and all the gossip, and you're just in this small network where, again, it's relationships and networking. Lots of things can happen in that space.
Another part of our conversation was whether there was a way to play the power game and win in Tudor times, regardless of social status.
In a sense, I don't even include the king or the queen as a power player. I mean, they're the monarch. They're the power. The players are all the people who want to get into the inner chamber and be able to whisper policy and influence into the monarch's ear. So this exhibition is about those people. So we might think of that today as like the cabinet, cabinet members who are at that upper level and meeting with the president all the time. In the Tudor period, it was the Privy Council, and then all of the other ministers who were hovering around at court and talking to the king on a daily basis. In terms of these other skills, dressing, yes, power dressing was very important. There was, and we can call them the fashion police in the period. There were laws known as sumptuary laws, which dictated who could wear, like what kind of fur, what color cloth, what type of cloth, how glittery your bangles were, all kinds of things. And that was based on social status. And one of the reasons why the walls inside the exhibition hall are painted purple is because purple was the most exclusive color. So there were laws stating that anyone under the rank of earl was not allowed to wear purple. And there were also some sub-laws about ruffs. Starched linen allowed collars to defy gravity, basically. So before that, there were floppy collars, and then these ruffs, which went around your neck, became more and more fanciful under Henry and then mostly under Queen Elizabeth. And at one point, Queen Elizabeth issued a decree saying that ruffs are getting monstrous and out of control, and her courtiers are spending way too much money to get these more and more elaborate ruffs, which were totally restrictive in terms of what you could do. Like imagine having like a foot-long rim going around your neck. I mean, imagine trying to eat and get, a food in your hand around the ruff. So your ruff had to be just right to pass muster with the queen in the period. Other ways of showing your power was through hospitality. And so we have a case in the exhibition which includes a book on napkin folding. And it was published in Italy. And again, this goes back to all the magical things you can do with starched linen. So you could create a whole scene on your banquet table just by having your napkins, your starched linen napkins, folded into animals and ships and magical figures. And then the people you were dining with would marvel at the skill and the talent you had access to. And that would increase your social cachet. There was also this idea of carving. So there's always a big deal here in the States of carving the turkey at Thanksgiving. Carving was an art form in this period. And again, this, like the napkin folding, the carving fads started in Italy in the early 16th century. And the Italian carvers created this method of airborne carving, holding your chunk of meat on a big fork up in the air and then taking your knife or sword and with great technical skill, slicing off pieces of meat that would fall onto the plates of the people who were at your table. And then there was the branding element of being a power player in this period. And a lot of that, there were no cell phones, of course, in that period, but people needed to know what you looked like to be able to recognize you. And you could do that partly through what you wear and the display of your coat of arms and things like that. But getting your image out, particularly after a recent promotion, you'd want to hire a court painter to make a painting of you. And that painting is just a single painting, and that doesn't do you any good. You need copies of that painting. So then other painters would come in and make copies, and your goal was to get your painting in as many long galleries or great halls as possible so that people walking down those halls for their exercise would look at all the paintings and see yours and know exactly what you look like. So we have an example of that in the exhibition of one person, the Earl of Southampton, and the various versions of his portrait that were made. So that was like the public way of sharing your image. But if you were really networking at a much more surgical level, wanting to gain intimacy with certain people specifically rather than just having your image known generally, you would get a miniature made. And miniatures were tiny little round or oval paintings. And this was an art that began in Tudor England and thrived in Tudor England. So we have 5 miniatures in the exhibition that showcase the exquisite level of detail that went into these portraits. And if you received one of these portraits from somebody, it was quite the gift. The portraits were so small you could hold them in your hand or wear them around your neck. And they were generally more informal and intimate than a large portrait would have been. So that was another important way.
Heather gave us details about 2 artifacts in the exhibit: a letter from Cromwell and Anne of Cleves' prayer book.
So there is one section and one rule in the exhibition, which is hang on to your head. And that's the section about cancel culture and how to avoid getting canceled. Thomas Cromwell got canceled in 1540. So he, along with the Earl of Essex and Sir Walter Raleigh, are in that section. And there are 2 items in the Cromwell case. One of them is a prayer book that belonged to Anne of Cleves. And there is an inscription in this prayer book that says, I beseech your grace, when you look on this, remember me, your grace's assured Anne, the daughter of Cleves. This was a book of hours that she gave to Henry VIII, and we think she gave it to him after their marriage was annulled, when she was the king's sister. So that's an incredible artifact to have at the Folger, and just to see her own handwriting, writing out that note to this husband who did not want to be married to her. That was a very short marriage, yes. And then the other item in the exhibition, it's actually 2 letters. It's 2 copies of the same letter. So in this period, the postal system was very unreliable. As you can imagine, things had to travel by horse and ship over long distances in all kinds of weather. And so what I love about these 2 items is the fact that they survive. So Thomas Cromwell wrote a letter to the English ambassador in Cleves in October of 1539. So this is Henry VIII is very anxious to meet his new wife. The marriage contract has been signed, but he's not laid eyes on her. He's only seen this portrait that was painted by Hans Holbein the Younger. And so in this letter, he writes that the king does not a little muse and marvel that since the departure of the orators of Cleves and Saxe, they have not heard anything in England about the proceedings and when Anne of Cleves is going to come. So the king is very anxious to meet Anne of Cleves, and he has Cromwell show his displeasure to the English ambassador in Cleves, saying, there's just been silence, crickets. You're in trouble unless you get Anne of Cleves over here pronto. The reason there are 2 copies of this letter is because of the unreliability of the postal system. Cromwell wrote the letter twice and sent it by 2 different messengers who took 2 different routes to get to Cleves, which was in Germany, to deliver this letter. And both of them ended up arriving and were part of Wotton's papers and stayed together, for over 500 years before they came to the Folger. And we just acquired them quite recently in 2012. So that's an extraordinary letter, or 2 letters at an extraordinary moment in Cromwell's life.
You've been enjoying Historical Drama with the Boston Sisters, a podcast where we talk about historical drama series and films as windows to the past and mirrors of the present.
Visit our webpage at michonbostongroup.com/Boston Sisters. Share this podcast. Join our historical drama community by signing up for our newsletter to stay up to date on future episodes and bonus content.
Now, back to our podcast conversation.
Welcome back to Historical Drama with the Boston Sisters. I'm Michon Boston. Tequina and I continue our conversation with Dr. Heather Wolfe, Curator of Manuscripts at the Folger Shakespeare Library here in Washington, D.C. We were visiting with Dr. Wolfe at the Folger Library after seeing the exhibit, How to Be a Power Player, Tudor Edition. Heather Wolfe is the curator for that exhibition and also gave us another bonus, additional manuscripts from the library's collections related to the characters in the PBS Masterpiece series, Wolf Hall, The Mirror, and The Light.
When I heard you were coming, I thought, let's look and see what other Cromwell and Anne of Cleves items that we have. And I found this little receipt, and it's from a brewer who is agreeing to repay a loan to Thomas Cromwell of £5. But Cromwell doesn't want cash. He wants to be paid in beer. And so this document provides the details of the arrangement that this brewer will deliver to Cromwell's household 1 kilderkin of beer at 2 shillings a kilderkin per week. What's a kilderkin? It's a half barrel of beer. It holds about 18 gallons of gear. It holds about 18 gallons of beer.
Beer is gear.
So in order for this loan to be fully repaid, that's 50 kilderkins or 50 weeks worth of beer for Thomas's pretty big household. I'm not sure if 18 gallons would be enough or he had to supplement in other ways. And what's lovely about this receipt is it's signed by the brewer who was not literate in terms of being able to sign with a signature of his name. So he signs with a mark, which looks like a really thick, dark ink arrow. This next item is signed at the top, Henry VIII. And if you look closely, you can see that it was actually, he didn't write out his name. He had an official wooden stamp that he dipped in ink and then pressed onto the manuscript. So the rest of the manuscript is written by one of his scribes, and then it's signed on the top with this wooden stamped signature. This also is written at a very crucial moment for people who are watching The Mirror and the Light. This was written in November 24th, 1539. So Anne of Cleves is in Calais. She's traveled from Cleves to Calais. She's about to cross over the channel into England. Henry VIII hasn't met her yet, but he wants to make sure that she gets the best welcome ever. So in this document, he says, "By God's grace, we've concluded a marriage between us and the most excellent princess, the Lady Anne of Cleves, who's going to shortly arrive." And so therefore, this letter went out to a lot of gentlemen in the area, and it's in order for them to show up on December 10th and bring 6 servants. You should ride in horses wearing coats of black velvet with the chains of gold about their necks, and you should wear gowns of velvet or some other good silk. And it's given under our signet at Westminster, November 24th. So this is the welcome party for Anne of Cleves in that moment right before she meets Henry VIII in person for the first time.
Now we have a document that is from Anne of Cleves or to Anne of Cleves.
So after the marriage was annulled between Anne of Cleves and Henry VIII, Anne of Cleves became the royal sister to Henry VIII. And part of the breakup agreement was a huge allowance that she would get every year, plus a lot of property. So this document is signed at the bottom, Anna, the daughter, and it's an indenture. So like one of those big parchment documents that has that wavy edge at the top. And she's agreeing to rent one of the manors that Henry VIII gave her to this man, Sir Thomas Cromwell, and we have his papers at the Folger. So that's how we ended up with this particular document. But her signature is extraordinary, so I hope you can show an image of this on your website.
So now we have an actual play by W.S.
Yes. So I pulled out a printed pamphlet with the title, "The True Chronicle History of the Whole Life and Death of Thomas Lord Cromwell." And it says on the title, as you just said, written by W.S., and it was published in 1602. W.S. at the time, people might think that this was a play written by William Shakespeare. And scholars think maybe that's why the publisher put W.S. on the title page. This is a play about the rise and fall of Thomas Cromwell, and this is 62 years after his beheading, and people were still fascinated by the story. And they loved this genre of history play where you could learn from the tragedies of the past and apply them to things that you see around you in terms of current events. So this play went through a number of editions, and it made its way into Shakespeare's canon for about 100 years, from the 1630s to the 1730s. And at that point, Shakespeareans realized, no, this is not quite the quality of Shakespeare. It doesn't really fit in with the rest of his writing. So we're going to take this out of his known plays. But for 100 years, people thought it was actually probably written by Shakespeare.
Class status is a big deal in numerous historical dramas we've talked about on Historical Drama with the Boston Sisters. What did class distinctions and status mean in Tudor times? Though Thomas Cromwell rose to high rank in Henry VIII's court, he was looked down on by aristocrats. In Wolfe Hall, The Mirror and the Light, Cromwell is referred to as the blacksmith's son, and dog as in loyal servant, despite his education, intellect, strategic mind, and position in Henry VIII's court. Heather explained that it was not unique for someone of Cromwell's social status to rise in the court. There were others who rose through the ranks and gained favor with the monarchs.
I think you're right that intelligence and loyalty were two very important attributes to becoming a power player, regardless of your social status, whether or not you're an aristocrat or not. And I would say a third thing is your ability to handle a crisis is very important. And I think Henry really valued that in Thomas Cromwell. He could handle a crisis way better than any of the noblemen who were in Henry VIII's court. So I think, social hierarchies were so embedded in the English culture in this period, and aristocracy, was such a huge thing. So yes, he was always going to feel a bit on the outside, and maybe it's the work of novelists to say what motivates people to sort of get through that. But Thomas Cromwell is an amazing story, but he's not the only person who wasn't an aristocrat who succeeded at court. There are plenty of people. There are people from all over the world who were in the court of Henry VIII and then, later Elizabeth I, who didn't have that English aristocratic pedigree. So yes, I think it was something he always dealt with. It was used against him at opportune moments. He didn't have the comfort of generational wealth and all those other things that come along with being an aristocrat. But he navigated it quite well until the very end, when the Duke of Norfolk sort of led to his downfall.
Though How to Be a Power Player Tudor Edition crosses over the reign of Henry VIII, its primary focus is the reign of Elizabeth I, Henry's daughter by Anne Boleyn, whose tragic fate continues to weigh on the conscience of Thomas Cromwell. Heather gave insights on how women exercise power in Tudor times.
Women were heads of households in this period, and I think, I should clarify, when I'm speaking about women, I'm talking about high-status women who today we might think, it was such a patriarchal system, they didn't have much power. They actually, controlled the purse at home. We have in the exhibition a case called Lean In, which talks about Bess of Hardwicke. She was the wealthiest woman in England, except for Elizabeth I, and one of the wealthiest people, not just one of the wealthiest women in England. And she was born into a, sort of wealthy family, but nothing too grand. And she married 4 times. And with each marriage, she strategically got herself closer and closer to Elizabeth I, so that she really could not be ignored because of her wealth and because of who her husband was and her husband's role at court. So we have letters from 3 of her husbands writing to her with such deference in one of the cases. And we have many other letters to her in our collection at the Folger. And if you didn't know who the recipient of the letter was, you wouldn't necessarily know if they were writing to a man or woman. They're just writing to a powerful person who they need to be in her good graces in order for them to succeed. So she commanded her own household, but also she and her husband were in charge of Mary Queen of Scots when Mary Queen of Scots was in prison. So she was very much on Elizabeth's radar because of that. And she was one of the best strategic gift givers in the period as well. So one of the rules in the exhibition is get on the gift list. And that's about this tradition of giving New Year's gifts to the monarch on New Year's Day. And it was an invitation-only sort of event, and Bess of Hardwicke was always on it, and always she would collaborate with the other female members in her household, and they would discuss, like, okay, what kind of sleeves should we get? What kind of corset? What kind of doublet? And they would work together and think about colors and textures and motifs that they wanted to communicate with that gift. People gave jewels and other things too, but you always wanted the queen to be impressed by your gift, and Bess of Hardwicke was a great gift giver. And she also was an amazing accountant. So we have 2 of her account books at the Folger where she's detailing every single household expense down to the penny. So even though she had massive wealth, she was also very, very careful with it, and really was, one of the most powerful people in England.
Finally, we asked Heather what she wants visitors to come away with after experiencing the exhibit, How to Be a Power Player, Tudor Edition.
I want people to be surprised by all of the similarities in how people navigated social hierarchies then and now. But I also want them to be amazed by the differences as well. At the beginning of thinking through this exhibition, we thought about it as diving into a rabbit hole where everything is topsy-turvy. Why would we put a book about airborne carvery or napkin folding into an exhibition about power players? And I really wanted to get across that there are all these skills you need. It's not just intuition or intelligence or savvy that gets you where you need to go. You also had to really work hard, and you needed to be able to navigate very complicated systems and be physically fit and a good dancer and a good musician and a good host and be able to quote classical literature. I mean, that idea of the Renaissance man really involved so many dimensions. And so my hope is that exhibition shows all of these dimensions that you needed to have to get the attention of Queen Elizabeth or Henry VIII in the period.
To Queen and I want to thank Dr. Heather Wolfe, Folger Shakespeare Library Curator of Manuscripts, for this look behind the scenes of power in Tudor times. We also thank Colleen Kennedy, Senior Communications Manager for the Folger Shakespeare Library, who arranged our meeting with Heather. We hope this conversation helps you, as it helped us, understand the rise and fall of Thomas Cromwell and other members of the British court in Tudor times while watching Wolfe Hall, The Mirror and the Light on PBS Masterpiece. How to Be a Power Player Tudor Edition is on display through July 2025 at the Folger Shakespeare Library in Washington, D.C. Go to the Folger website at www.folger.edu. Folger is spelled Folger, for more information about visitor experiences, performances, and online resources. Wolfe Hall, The Mirror and the Light broadcasts on Masterpiece Sunday nights on PBS. You can also stream the series on PBS Passport, the PBS Masterpiece Prime Video channel, and for free for 14 days from broadcast on pbs.org/masterpiece. Hilary Mantel's The Mirror and the Light and the previous historical novels in the trilogy based on the life of Thomas Cromwell are available for purchase in our affiliate bookstore. Go to our webpage at michonbostongroup.com/Boston Sisters or the podcast description for the link. Your book purchases support historical drama with the Boston Sisters podcast with a small commission and independent booksellers in your community.
Subscribe to Historical Drama with the Boston Sisters wherever you enjoy your favorite podcasts. Leave a review. Michon and I hope you'll give the podcast 5 stars. Sign up for the e-newsletter to stay up to date on new podcasts, bonus episodes, and historical drama-related resources and activities. You can find the link on the webpage as well. Follow us on Instagram at Historical Drama Sisters and on Facebook at Historical Drama Boston Sisters. Like and share Historical Drama with the Boston Sisters on your social media.
This is Michon Boston.
And this is Tequina Boston.
Thank you for listening. We hope you enjoyed this episode of Historical Drama with the Boston Sisters, a podcast about historical films and series dramas. Visit our webpage at michonbostongroup.com/Boston Sisters.
Tell us what historical dramas you're watching. Who knows? We may do a show about it. Sign up for our newsletter, subscribe to the podcast, and share it with the people you know who binge on historical drama.
Historical Drama with the Boston Sisters is brought to you by the Michon Boston Group. The views and opinions expressed on Historical Drama with the Boston Sisters are those of the speakers and do not represent the positions or views of the Michon Boston Group, its clients, or affiliates. This is Michon Boston.
And this is Tequina Boston. Thank you for listening.